The Ghost of Fossil Glen, Chapter 13. At school the next day, Mr. Henry handed back the students' journals. The room grew quiet as everyone studied Mr. Henry's comments. Eagerly, Allie read, "Nice job, Allie. This story is very intriguing. I like the way you began with the mysterious message, 'I am Al.' Right away I was curious to read more. This shows good imagination. I can't wait to see what will happen next." Allie smiled. Mr. Henry had liked her journal. He had praised her imagination. Of course she thought he doesn't know I'm writing about things that really happened. He thinks I'm making up a story. But he found it intriguing. Allie thought that was a good word to describe what was going on. She raised her head as Mr. Henry began speaking again. "I noticed that some of you had a little trouble getting started," he said. "I'm hoping that writing in your journals will come to be a pleasure, not a chore. I really meant it when I said you may write about anything you like. You're not writing to please me, but to stretch your imaginations and to talk to yourselves about the things that are going on in your lives. Some of you wrote about private thoughts and problems, which is fine. Others of you wrote very unusual pieces." He looked at Allie. "Allie, how would you feel about reading your entry aloud?" "You don't have to say yes. I was just thinking that your story would be a good example of an entry that was a little different." Allie hesitated. Mr. Henry's request had caught her by surprise. She felt torn between pride and embarrassment. "Come on, Allie," said Joey. "Let's hear it." "Yeah, Allie, read," other voices urged. "You don't have to if you don't want to," Mr. Henry repeated. "It's okay," said Allie. She looked around at her classmates. Most of them were regarding her with great interest. Dub was grinning encouragingly. She glanced toward Karen and was immediately sorry. Karen's arms were folded across her chest and she mouthed the words, "Teacher's pet." Allie looked away and reluctantly began to read. "I am L. The words appeared mysteriously on the opening page of my journal. I sat down to write, and there they were. But that is not the beginning of the story." Allie continued reading until she came to the end. "Who is L? I plan to find out." There was a brief silence before the class broke into spontaneous applause, all except for Pam, who was looking at Karen, and Karen, who was staring off into space with a bored expression on her face. "Cool story, Al," said Brad. Other voices echoed, "Yeah. What's going to happen next?" asked Tricia. "Who cares?" Allie heard Karen mutter. "I don't know," said Allie. Boy, was that the truth. Mr. Henry was beaming at her. "Thanks, Allie. I enjoyed it even more the second time. After hearing that example of imaginative writing, I hope all of you will cut loose in your journals and express yourselves as freely as you like." "But now please put your journals away and let's head down to the library," Mr. Henry said. "I talked with Mrs. Foster about your interest in Fossil Glen, and she had a terrific idea. She suggested that we alternate field study trips to the Glen with research trips to the library. She's all set to help you find answers to the questions we raised yesterday. So get your pencils and notebooks and let's go." As they walked through the hall to the library, Mr. Henry fell into step beside Allie. "I hope I didn't put you on the spot, Allie," he said. "I really wanted the rest of the class to hear your work." Allie shook her head. "It's okay," she said. "I didn't mind." They walked a few steps in silence. Then Allie said, "Mr. Henry?" "Yes?" "Do you think anything like that could really happen?" "Do you mean something like what happened in your story?" asked Mr. Henry. "Yes." Mr. Henry looked into Allie's face for a moment before answering carefully. "I think this, Allie. The world is a very complex, interesting place. Sometimes things happen that we don't understand. It doesn't mean there isn't an explanation. We simply haven't found it yet." Allie thought about that. It made sense. "Why do you ask?" said Mr. Henry. He wasn't making fun of her. He looked serious, as if he really wanted to know. For a second she thought about confiding in Mr. Henry. Then she remembered her parents' conversation the evening before, if they talked to Mr. Henry. No, she'd better keep quiet. For now, they were approaching the library door anyway. "Oh, I don't know," she answered. "I just wondered." "Well, keep wondering," said Mr. Henry with a smile. "That's how we learn." They walked into the library. As usual, it was a busy place filled with children choosing books, watching film strips, listening to cassettes, working on projects, and clicking away on their computers. Mrs. Foster, the librarian, was everywhere at once, it seemed, answering questions and offering advice on how to find things. There was a table piled high with materials she had gathered for Allie's class. "Mr. Henry tells me you want to know everything," she said with a smile. "So I've pulled out information on fossils." "Shh! Hey, that's enough." Lake and stream ecology and the Seneca Indians for starters. There's a pile of newspapers too, containing articles about the recent and not so recent history of the Glen. Come to me if you have any questions and I'd be happy to help you. After looking through the stacks of materials, the students scattered to tables to work. Mr. Henry had told them each to think of one question about fossil Glen and try to find the answer. That afternoon, they would share what they had learned. Allie headed straight for the information Mrs. Foster had gathered about fossils. She was about to reach for a book called Secrets in Stone when she heard the voice inside her head. "Look at the newspapers," it said. Allie froze. "The newspapers," repeated the voice. Forcing herself to act natural, Allie walked toward the table that held a stack of old editions of the local paper, the Seneca Times. She rifled through the pile. A photograph of a young girl with dark curly hair caught her eye. It was the girl from her nightmare, the girl whose face had appeared to her in the kitchen.